Welcome to another installment of Data Skeptic and our series on ad tech. Our focus today is podcast advertisements. I'm speaking with Rob Walch, VP of Podcaster Relations at Libsyn, and one of the most knowledgeable people I know of to talk about the podcast advertising space.
My name is Rob Walch. I am the VP of Podcaster Relations and also Platform Partnerships and Enterprise at Libsyn. And you can get a hold of me at rob@libsyn.com.
Well, for listeners who aren't familiar with Libsyn, which is actually where Data Skeptic is hosted, can you tell us a little bit about what you guys do?
Libsyn was the first podcast hosting company, and people will say, what do you need a hosting company for? Well, if you listen to a podcast, and you go into Apple Podcasts, is where most people go to listen. None of those podcasts are hosted by Apple. Apple doesn't actually host podcasts, so you need a third party to host those media files. And Libsyn was the very first of those third parties, actually before Apple even supported podcasting, going back to November 2004. So that's how long Libsyn has been around.
So from a technical perspective, what is a podcast really? Behind the scenes, the way an engineer might describe it.
Well, an engineer's description of a podcast is any media file that is deliverable via an RSS feed that is RSS 2.0 compliant, and that can be an audio file, a video file, or a PDF. So if you can get real technical, a podcast can be audio, video, or PDF. Now, Apple Podcasts is one of the few places that actually supports if you put a PDF in there, but Libsyn actually does support that. So we do fully support audio, video, and PDF. From a simpler point of view, I just say you're not a podcast if you don't have an RSS feed and you aren't in Apple Podcasts. And that's the simplest thing. You have to be in Apple Podcasts. You have to have an RSS feed if you really want to say you're a podcast, because what people don't realize is getting into Apple's directory gets you into a whole bunch of other directories. It gets you into Overcast and CastBox and Pocket Casts. And over 120 different apps pull from Apple's podcast directory. So you really want to be in Apple's directory, and you have to have an RSS feed if you want to say you're a podcast. Just putting an audio file link up on your website does not make you a podcast.
Yeah, so having an RSS feed, I guess, and as you point out, being an Apple is critical. But there is that long tail of so many, seems like there's a new one every week, a new site I can go to listen to podcasts on if I wanted to. They're getting them all from Apple's directory. Is that a crawl, or how do they actually do it?
Apple makes a directory available so that these new services can pull the RSS feeds and then have those feeds listed in their service. So when you submit your feed to Apple, the terms you agree to are to allow Apple to make that out there available. Most people don't even realize what they agree to because, no one ever reads Apple's terms and conditions.
Right.
But it's there. And again, it's just Apple making their meta directory available to whoever wants to use it. And Apple's been a good steward for podcasting and it's done a good job on that. Some other companies try to lock things down, have shows that are just exclusive on them, but Apple's never been about that, and that's been good for everybody.
So my RSS feed is, some metadata, the title and description and all this kind of stuff, and then essentially a list of MP3 files in my case. So that's great because all the software out there can figure out how to get the files, but how do you get some analytics on downloads and things like that?
That's where your podcast host comes in. That's the job of your podcast host, is to give you those metrics. Since we're the server, again, when someone goes and clicks play at Apple Podcasts or it automatically downloads at Apple Podcasts, it's calling back to the server where the file's hosted, and that's going to be where Libsyn is. So even if you have a web player on your website, a media player, and someone clicks play on that file is being delivered from your host, from Libsyn server, in your case from Libsyn, and we're recording that. So what some people consider streams, when people click play, those are really still technically a download. They're called, from a technical point of view, it's called a progressive download. And those things are recorded on the Libsyn side. And then there's stats called IAB stats, and IAB stands for Interactive Advertising Bureau, and those are the standard of podcast stats. And you want to be on a host that is IAB certified, and Libsyn, again, is. I personally was on the committee that wrote the specs. What makes a download is at least 1 minute's worth of content has been delivered to the end user. You only count that end user one time in a 24-hour window. So if that user comes in and requests that same file 4 times, you only count it once in that 24-hour window.
Do you see a lot of people trying to be sneaky and boost their stats up by, I don't know, doing 10,000 downloads or something like that?
Some people go out and they hire companies that are in other countries that have click farms. If you watch Silicon Valley, if you're a fan of that, there was one scene where they showed where Jared had hired a click farm to pump their numbers up. Some people do that. Oftentimes, we can figure that out and we can filter that out. And we know which IP addresses some of those come from out overseas, and we filter that stuff out. That's what good hosts will do for you. But yeah, people absolutely do try to do that, and we've seen that. We've seen people do that and say, hey, we want to be part of an ad campaign, and we look at their numbers and go, something's not quite right. Why are all these downloads coming from a browser? And then we track it down and realize, oh, they're bogus numbers.
Yeah. Downloads, at least in my experience on this podcast, and I'm sure on many others, it's overwhelmingly iTunes where the listenership comes from.
Right. If Apple Podcasts is your user agent isn't number one, it's a red flag.
Yeah.
And if it's, and I've seen it on shows where their top 4 user agents are Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and Mozilla, and you're like, that's not good. And you're like, yep, something's not right here. And sure enough, you look into it and you find out, it's someone trying to game the system.
Yeah. Have you ever encountered a legitimate outlier, like maybe some real deep Android developer show only gets Android downloads or something like that? Or do you see the same stats pan out everywhere?
No, we do see some. One show that I know of, its number one user agent is Ghana. Ghana is out of India, and it's a music streaming service there, and his audience was mostly in Southeast Asia. That app became his number one, and some every now and then I'll see Spotify number one. I recently saw for someone Rezo became number one. Rezo is a music app, comes from the same people that make TikTok, but it's not in the U.S. yet. So this person had a big audience in Brazil, and Rezo was number one. So we do see others, but for the most part, the majority of shows, especially when their downloads are from the U.S., the majority of the shows, Apple Podcast is number one. And overall, just to put things in perspective, Apple Podcast, iTunes ecosystem, we see that number in the upper 60% across the board. Spotify as number 2 comes in at around 12%.
Yep, that sounds about on par with our experience. Well, one of the reasons we host with Libsyn is not just for those analytics, but because you then are doing all the filtering. So if one of our advertisers says we want to know something about your download numbers and we want to make sure you're legitimate, we kind of inherit the legitimacy of Libsyn, that you guys do this kind of filtering as an independent third party. Do you see that as a main reason why a lot of people use that data to share with advertisers?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's one of the biggest reasons people host with Libsyn has been our metrics over the years, and wanting to see that, and the fact that our metrics update in real time or close to it, about 15, they update every 15 minutes in chunks. But we don't do a static one-day update like a lot of people do. We actually update real time. And the validity, when you go to someone and say, here's my numbers from Libsyn, all the advertising agencies, they know those numbers are going to be good.
So on our season here on Data Skeptic about ad tech, I think we've mostly, at least so far, covered a lot of like web-based ads, pay-per-click, things like that. And I think listeners will know that if you have a website, you can potentially monetize it with something like Google AdSense, or we have ethical ads on our site. So it's a third party. We just put a little tag in and they provide the ads. And I think I have some control. But it's not really an equivalent in podcasting. And broadly speaking, how do podcast ads work?
Well, we do have that now at Libsyn. If you want to have ads, you can have what we call ads on demand, pre-produced ads by third parties that get stitched in on your episodes, pre-roll, post-roll, and if you want mid-roll ads as well. And you just say, I want these for my show, and we'll go across your entire back catalog and put these pre-produced ads that you don't have to be involved with. And we have some podcast hosts that say, hey, I want advertising, I just don't want to do host read. They don't feel comfortable doing host read, so we do have that available. And if you are getting 10,000 or more downloads a month, it makes a lot of sense. And you don't want to do host read, but you want to monetize, then this makes sense. So I would say, reach out to me, rob@libsyn.com. I can help you on that. But the CPM rates are going to be lower than if you did a host read, but the host read is going to be only on your most recent episode. So, there's give and take there on that. But host read is still where the majority of money is made in podcasting, because if you have a big show and you can do a host read, you charge a much higher CPM.
Why is that?
Better ROI for the advertisers, so they're willing to pay more. Again, it depends on the product that it's being trying to be sold. But if you're looking for a product where you want kind of an influencer bump to it, podcasting is a great influencer medium, and podcast listeners love the podcast hosts.
Yeah, you'd mentioned that 10,000 a month kind of entry point. Could you summarize broadly, what does it take, if I start a new show tomorrow and it's about bass fishing, what is a typical ramp up to get to that level?
Most never get there. So there's different numbers to look at. If you want to do host read ads, you want to be at around at least 5,000 downloads per new episode within 30 days of release. If you want to do the more ads on demand, offering, like how you have on your website, the equivalent of that in podcasting, you want to be 10,000 a month in downloads. So there's a couple different ways you can get to 10,000 downloads a month. One is release a lot of episodes every month. Mm-hmm. Release an episode every day and keep doing that, and have your content be evergreen about history content, and you'll hit that 10,000 a month before you know it. But if you're doing something that's more timely, like one of my other podcasts, Today in iOS, where what I talked about in 2009 isn't as relevant today on that show, people aren't likely downloading those 2009 episodes or 2007 episodes when the show launched. In those cases, you have to build an audience up to get to that 10K download number per month. So it takes work. But I would say the biggest thing is be consistent in releasing. Consistently release new content every week, or if you do a daily podcast every day, those will help you get to that goal of hitting that 10K a month.
So we're coming up almost on 2 decades of podcasting, and probably just shy of that, the same thing for podcast advertising. What does the market look like today? Have we hit sort of a stable point, or is it still in growth mode?
Oh, it's still in growth mode. I've been in the space since the beginning, and I can tell you, the very first advertisers, it was basically Audible and a few others, and things have changed. And it all originally was DR, and now, which is direct response, where there's a call to action, and the audience goes and does that action, and then they measure that and see if it's worth advertising again. Versus, today where we now have ads that are just purely branding plays, where I hear some of these pre-produced ads are for, I heard one the other day, because I live in Nashville, I heard one the other day for the Tennessee Lottery on a podcast. So they were looking at my geolocation and delivered an ad for me specifically because I was in Tennessee. So that's kind of where we've come on this space. We've come from this DR, don't track anything, to now they're looking at where you're located as a listener and giving you ads based on your location. And some of them are based on location and the content you're listening to. And some are even location and you're at and who you are, because they know who else they've delivered to you.
To what degree is that tracked? I know there's been a lot of movements now with adding privacy, especially on the Apple ecosystem. How much can they track me? Thanks to our sponsor, Neptune.ai. 99% of machine learning teams are doing awesome things at a reasonable scale with 4 people and 2 production models. But most of the industry best practices come from a handful of companies operating models at hyperscale. The folks over at Neptune.ai want to change that by sharing insights, tool stacks, and real-life stories from practitioners doing machine learning and ML ops at a reasonable scale. They even built a flexible tool for experiment tracking and model registry that will fit with your workflow at no scale, reasonable scale, and beyond. Check them out at Neptune.ai. Hi, I'm another one of those podcast ads that you've managed to tune out so effectively. It's okay, I get it. Listening to podcasts comes with some degree of ad fatigue. But today, you need to listen up, because I'm here to tell you about ad fatigue's sinister cousin, alert fatigue. Did you know the average company receives 11,000 security alerts each day? How can a security team stay on top of the most critical threat risks when they can't find the signal in all the noise? Well, they can't, which makes it easy for IT teams to fall victim to alert fatigue, making your company dangerously vulnerable. So you have two choices. Buy all the tools you can until you've made your security operations overwhelmingly complex and totally ineffective, or you can run with the pack. Arctic Wolf is the industry leader in security operations solutions, delivering 24/7 monitoring, assessment, and response through their patented concierge security model. Arctic Wolf works with your existing tools and becomes an extension of your existing IT team, and they never get fatigued. Got your attention now, didn't I? Visit arcticwolf.com/skeptic to learn more. That's arcticwolf.com/skeptic. How much can they track me?
In podcasting, from the tracking point of view, it isn't shut down like it is on some of the website stuff. The IP addresses are still getting through, so they can track you based on the IP address and user agent combo. So that is, in podcasting world, that is still wide open in the U.S., not so much in Europe or Brazil, but in the U.S. it is, and for the most part, it's still done that way.
And do those sorts of efforts fall like broadly under GDPR kind of stuff, or do you think there'll one day be some scrutiny looking at those practices?
Well, again, Europe has got the GDPR, but in the U.S. we don't have that equivalent yet. Now we've got a CCPA, which is coming, CIPRA, and that's changing in California. You've got privacy laws coming up in Colorado, Virginia, and I think Washington, and a few other states are putting laws in. And then there's a bill right now in Congress about a national privacy one. But so far, the U.S. doesn't have that. Now, more than likely, we do need to get that because we can't do data transfers with Europe right now because we don't have a national law. To exchange more data out of Europe, we're going to need to have something in the U.S. So eventually we'll get there. But right now, unfortunately, it's just a hodgepodge. The U.S. is the Wild West when it comes to data privacy.
Makes sense, yeah.
Or lack thereof.
Well, if I were an advertiser with a big budget and I needed to get my name and my product out there and I wanted to explore podcasting, can you talk about first steps? Do I pick shows or do I pick categories? How do I go about it?
I would recommend you go to advertisecast.com, which, full and fair disclosure, Libsyn owns, because they're going to get access to 3,000 plus podcasts. That's going to give you access. And then the agency, the AdvertiseCast as your agency that you're going to work with, they're going to go and they're going to validate numbers. So you're not going to have to deal with that, and you wouldn't have to deal with the podcasters. They'll deal with the relationship on the podcaster side. And you just tell them, hey, I've got this product. This is the type of content that I'm looking for, and they'll come back to you with shows that have audience that match up to what you're looking for. That's the best way to do it today. If you're someone looking to advertise on a podcast, is work with someone like AdvertiseCast that has many podcasts that you can choose from. So you're not just into one show or two shows. You're getting to test it on many shows.
And do you see any trends in who's interested in this? Is it, young companies, startups that recognize that there's a growing and niche audience, or are the big brands at play? Who's really buying most of the podcast ads?
Well, early on, it was Audible because it made sense for Audible, right? The audio. So that made sense. But beyond that, a lot of the DR advertisers were people that had limited budgets. They had to be very strategic. They had to see if the call to actions were working. And podcasting is where Harry's razors really took off. Casper mattress really took off. Ring doorbell, Eero routers, all of these services, products, I should say, got their real big kick through podcast advertising. HelloFresh and some other meal ones. BetterHelp is still a big advertiser today on podcasts. It's been services that are looking to, in some cases like Harry's Razors or services like that, where they're looking for repeat customers, although Casper isn't so much a repeat one, but Harry's made sense. The meal service plans make sense. They're trying to get, they're a subscription service, and finding podcast listeners who have notoriously higher income when you do the demographics of podcast listeners fits well with the HelloFresh of the world's type of what they're looking for a target audience.
So we have to date always done on my podcast, host read, insert, maybe we did some insert at some point, but 99% of the time it's me reading an ad, my own voice, and a mid-roll, largely actually because of your suggestions when I listen to the feed podcast and kind of understanding that those are the ones that appeal and seem to convert the best. But I also am starting to get tempted by our long back catalog, some of which has ads for companies that were acquired or aren't around. Or even that geolocation stuff you'd mentioned. Conferences hit us up, but there's no reason to have a Southern California conference in Maine, perhaps, something like that. The dynamic stuff's getting more interesting to me. Do you think we're going to see a trend in that direction, or is it just the strength of the advertiser read that's going to keep it the way it is today?
I think what you're going to see is a mixture. It's a hybrid. You're going to be doing host-read ads for your most recent episodes, but your older episodes are going to have more the programmatic, the pre-produced ads. So you're still making money off your old content that's over 90 days old from pre-produced ads at a lower CPM rate, but at least you're making money off of those downloads. But you're still getting the higher rates for your most recent ads, which again will the host-read ads, when done right, convert much better than the pre-produced ads, period. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Everything shows that in every measurement.
Well, I've spent some time in my professional life working on PPC algorithmic management. We thought we did some pretty sophisticated things, managing all the, with algorithms to control bids and budgets and whatnot. Do you find that level of sophistication is at play in the podcast space, or is it more hands-on in general?
It's still more hands-on. Yeah, we're not at that level, at that point.
Will it ever get there?
I don't know. I mean, podcasting is a different medium in that it's really personal medium to the audience. They listen in earbuds, so you're literally in the middle of their head. And they're picking the content they want to listen to. They're not stumbling upon it. They've gone out of their way to find it and listen to it. And it's very topical. So because of that, I still think the host read, that's still going to have a lion's share of the profits for the bigger shows. Now, mind you, for smaller shows that can't get to that, or shows where the host can't do something custom, then you're going to have the opportunities for that more programmatic type of advertisements. And those will, for those certain types of shows, will be the primary way that they are actually going to monetize. But for a show that's got 10,000, 15, 20, 50,000 downloads an episode, and the host is willing to do an ad read, I believe the ad reads will remain their primary source of revenue for the foreseeable future. It could be wrong, but right now, the advertisers see the return on investment still better with that, so that they're going to continue to pay better for that. And as you know, the problem with programmatic over time is it's usually a race to the bottom on pricing.
Yeah, absolutely it is. And not always on quality at the same time.
Right.
Well, a lot of marketing groups, when they've gone out and spent a big budget, they start to look at where did our money go, what return on investment did we get, and there's this challenge of attribution. When you have something in your browser, like pay-per-click advertising, it's very easy for PPC to take credit for everything, because they track so well, and IP and cookies and all this kind of stuff. Whereas a podcast ad, maybe there's a coupon code or a specific URL, but it could be very reasonable to say a lot of the visitors just learn the brand and don't bother with the code or the / whatever. It's much harder to track. Is that something, a conversation you have to have with people getting into the space, or do people get it, that it's a little fuzzier, I suppose?
Some advertisers get it, some don't. Some media buyers think, oh, it's digital, right? And so it's all trackable. And then some will think, well, people, the listeners get to opt into this. So, right, what's the problem? Well, no, listeners in podcasting, there's never a place to opt in. So when someone goes to a website, yeah, you have the little thing that says, yes, I opt into all these agreements. That doesn't happen that way in podcasting. So there's certain things you can't do. That doesn't mean there are certain things that people aren't doing. It just means there's things you're not supposed to do. Again, why Europe's different. Right? You go afoul of GDPR. Ask Tinder what happens. They get fined 10% of their revenue. So you have to play by the rules on that. Now, that doesn't mean everyone is, but the majority, I believe, are. And again, in the podcast world, the biggest issue is just there's no place for that universal opt-in to the terms for those ads.
Yeah, an alternative to that we offer that I see a lot of other people doing is showing some survey results. We ask listeners, will you answer these questions? Can you talk a little bit about how that's impacted the podcasting space?
And that has been the primary way in the podcasting world that you're able to get an idea of who your audience is. If you host with Libsyn, it's survey.libsyn.com/what your show slug is. And that survey is pre-produced for you, and you can ask your audience, go to survey.libsyn.com/the feed and fill out my survey. And your audience will go and fill it out. And we've always looked at, if you are a podcaster and you can get 250 of your listeners to do that, one, it gave you valid data on who your audience was. Two, it showed us and the advertisers that your audience would do a call to action. So if, I've had shows say to me, they have 100,000 listeners, and they say, well, I can't get my listeners to fill out a survey. Well, if you can't get 250 people out of 100,000 to fill out a survey, that's not a great 100,000 audience. Right? They're not even, because I get shows that have 5,000 that can get 500 people to fill out the survey. But if you can't get them to do that, you're not getting them to go buy a Harry's Razor or a Casper mattress, that's for sure.
When companies are figuring out what they want to allocate, whether, it's Harry's, I see them online as well. They're probably on TV and radio if I looked at those mediums. I'm sure this varies widely across companies, but do you see any trends on the percentage allocation out of my total advertising budget I would put to podcasting?
There's not one universal number. I mean, it really depends on the advertiser. We have some that still put podcasting in their experimental budget. We have others that now podcasting is a line item in their budget, which is great. That wasn't the case 10, 15 years ago. But we're seeing more and more where they have an allocated percentage of their revenue. And again, it does vary from company to company and product to product on what goes in. We're just happy if any percentage goes to podcasting. Right? We're still at the point where if you looked at the total amount of ad revenue that was spent in 2021, and then just double what was spent on the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl had more money spent. So we're still in early days yet of podcast ad revenue. I mean, this year I think the number is maybe we're going to get to $1.5 billion in total ad revenue across all the shows. The future, some people are saying it's going to get to $20 billion. We're not quite there. And radio is significantly higher than that. So again, podcasting is still a small niche space for advertising spend, but growing. And we're going to be at $1.5 billion this year. And just, again, a couple years ago, we were barely at $600 million. We're doubling within 2 years, more than doubling within 2 years.
When I look at things like social media, I see kind of a turnover in platforms. Facebook has this perception, whether it's fair or not, that it's for older people. Podcasting has had, there have been a couple little startups and things like that trying to take a bite out of the audio streaming space. But for whatever reason, just plain old podcast RSS feed still seems to be king of the mountain. Do you see that changing at any point?
Some people will say yes, but I don't, because RSS is a really nice democratized medium or delivery method, and it's decentralized. It's not, yes, the majority do consume through Apple Podcasts, but they don't have to. They just do because that app is native and that's what people use. Eventually, there'll be a large percentage that consume through Google Podcasts when that app actually becomes native. But right now, Google Podcasts is in third place at 2.5% of consumption. But the beauty of RSS is it allows anyone to be a podcaster and get out to so many different places. You can get to every major music streaming service. When people ask me what's different today than 5 years ago, it really comes down to every major music streaming service now has podcast directory, be it Spotify, be it Ghana or JioSaavn or Deezer, Rezo, all these different services, iHeartRadio, they all have a podcast section. And that's great news for podcasters. It's never been easier for consumers to find a podcast than it is today.
You'd mentioned that the Google Podcast app is not yet native. Could you expand on the importance of that?
Some people on the Android side get their phones from the corporate team, they give it to them, and the phones are locked down and they can't install anything on the phone. And Unfortunately, on Android today, the Google Podcast app, while the code is in Android, the front-facing UI piece is not. You actually have to go to the Google Play Store and download the Google Podcast app, which is the front end that connects to the code that's already in Android. So hopefully we get to a point where natively, when you turn on your phone, there will be a podcast app. And people go, what was one of the big turning points in podcasting? And it wasn't Serial. Serial gets way too much credit for way too little than what they did. The reality is Serial benefited from iOS 8. iOS 8 is when the Apple Podcast app went native. And when the iOS 8 came out and the Apple Podcast app was native in the iPhone and you couldn't delete it, a lot of people asked, what is this purple app and why can't I delete it? And then they tapped on it and they discovered podcasting. And having that native app and having it where everything just works right. I mean, it is a better user experience using the Apple Podcast app on the iPhone than any other app because you can connect it with your AirPods to work seamlessly. You can double tap on your AirPods and skip forward 15 seconds or skip back 10. You can do things that it's just a better experience with that app when it's native. And they don't have that on the Android side. And today, because of that, it's a 5-to-1 ratio of downloads globally for iOS versus Android. But there's 5 times more Android devices in the world. So that means the average iPhone user consumes 25 times more podcasts than the average Android user.
Yeah, I remember it happening and how big of a deal it was. When you cut a tree down and you look at the rings, you can tell back in time if there was a drought or a good year or this or that. Do you see that event strongly in a lot of the older shows' analytics?
Yeah, we did. And matter of fact, why we say it wasn't a Serial bump, it was really an iOS 8 bump, was because the growth was on the iOS side. If it was Serial, the growth would have been on iOS and Android. But it wasn't. The growth was iOS. And there were a lot of shows that had a big bump that year because of that, or came out at the right time. Lore was a perfect example of a podcast that came out at that time and benefited from that. And in other podcasts, Joe Rogan really started taking off at that point as well. We saw shows that had been steady start really taking off and growing and growing and growing. Rogan went from a couple, 100,000 downloads a month or an episode to a couple million an episode a few years later.
Well, is there anything else listeners should know about the podcast ecosystem? They're obviously all consumers if they're hearing this now. They maybe not have put as much thought into the ads or the behind the scenes. Any insights to leave people with?
I think the one thing that people misunderstand is only a small percentage of the podcasts are really at the size where they can really monetize well with advertising. It's really in the 5 to 7% range of shows really get to that size that advertising is how they can monetize. It's better for a lot of shows to monetize through premium, where you offer up a premium offering, some content free, some content paid for. Having your own subscription service oftentimes is a better way to monetize. And if you can do both, if your show is big enough, you can do both, then ideally do both. Mark Maron used to do that. He had one point in time, he had 42,000 monthly subscribers to his premium podcast for $1.99, and it was nothing more than him listing all his episodes, making all his episodes available. And if you didn't subscribe, then you only got his 50 most recent. So, having a premium offering is a good way to monetize. Don't just think advertising when you think monetization.
Well, yeah, if only 5% get to that level, what does success look like for the other 95%?
Well, for many people that get into podcasting, they're not even getting into it for monetization, right? They're getting into it to build a brand, to have a good time with friends. It's a hobby. But if you're getting into it for monetization, and that's the only reason you're getting into podcasting, I'd say stop, take the money you're about to spend, go to the roulette wheel, put it on black. Much better odds of you making money. If your primary goal of measuring how successful your podcast is how much monetization you get, most people will be disappointed. It's just the way it is. Right? Not everybody can be a good, funny comedian, right?
Right.
I see podcasts all the time, and I say to some folks, look, if you've been doing a podcast for 3 years and you're a comedy podcast and you're getting 200 downloads an episode, you're just not funny. And if that offends you, you have no sense of humor on top of it, right? So not everybody can do that. But here's the other thing. You may get 300 downloads an episode, but your podcast is about pneumatic valves.
Yeah.
and you might be knocking it out of the park. So you have to look at what your content's about. Some people make money just by getting better career opportunities because they were in a niche that they did a podcast on that they were knowledgeable about, started getting asked to speak at conferences, promotions, sometimes to get clients. So it's there's a lot of different ways that you can, quote, monetize your podcast beyond even advertising or the premium, and that has to do with your career and your own, maybe of your own business, and using that to promote your business or yourself.
Rob, where can people find you online?
Very easy. Rob, R-O-B, at Libsyn.com is this way to get a hold of me. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's at Podcast411, but I mostly talk about the Chiefs, the Knicks, the Flyers. So it's more sports-oriented stuff there, but a little bit of podcasting. And then you can also find more about podcasting by going to thefeed.libsyn.com, and that's our podcast that we release every other week. I do it with Elsie Escobar, and that'll get you information and access to the most recent episodes.
Very cool. We'll have all that in the show notes so people can follow up. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your expertise.
Thanks so much for having me on the show, and thanks for hosting with Libsyn.
But the individualized algorithmic delivery felt so much more personalized and so much more targeted, and therefore had these kind of very individualizing effects when it came to those messages. Whereas they spoke to the fact that it felt easier to dismiss when it was just a TV ad that didn't really have a particular audience in mind.
That's next time on Data Skeptic Ad Tech.